Bryan Fuller, a TV show creator, was given a gift, but this gift followed 3 rules. The first rule, you can make a TV show, and in the first season it will come to life. In the second season, though, it will die. And if you keep that show going long enough, eventually, 3 nerdy people will talk about it in a podcast. This is UniversiTV.
Engage.
This is, excuse me, a damn fine cup of coffee.
I am the one who knocks.
Hi, I'm Jessica Richards.
I'm Ashley Zanter.
And I'm Scott Nielsen.
And this is UniversiTV. And today we're going to be talking about pushing daisies.
Yay!
Yay, pushing daisies!
AKA the story of the pie maker.
Yes, exactly. So Pushing Daisies is about Ned, played by Lee Pace, the pie maker who has an unusual gift of making people alive again. He uses the ability to solve murders and collect a reward and to make delicious pie. So we're talking about Pushing Daisies. It's, obviously been a show that's long since over. And we decided to talk about this because as part of our discussion of the history of television, we wanted to talk about significant shows or shows that are having an impact on the career of somebody who's doing something interesting right now. And American Gods was released just a couple of weeks ago, and we've been watching that. At some point, we'll probably talk about it on this show, but we wanted to kind of throw back and talk a little bit about where Bryan Fuller's career came from. He's the creator of Pushing Daisies, and this was an important piece for me. I thought it was really, really interesting. So we kind of wanted to discuss that and talk a little bit about how unique this show was when it was on. So we're going to talk about the show in its entirety.
Which is only 2 seasons.
Only 2 seasons, right. Because
so it's only slightly cheating.
That's part of the reason that we wanted to talk a little bit about this is Bryan Fuller's career is always cut short. Every time. Everything he puts on air gets canceled.
Well, it's interesting when you refer to, because we do shows in their first season or we do complete series, and I wouldn't call this complete in any way. No. It's so, it's definitely no, we had a lot we wanted to do.
I just want them to make it alive again.
Aww. No, because they brought it to life in the first season. They touched it once. And the second season, they touched it again.
That's so meta.
You have officially described my personality.
Oh, God.
So we kind of wanted to dive into this and talk a little bit about, what were some of the themes or ideas that sort of were prevalent or important about Pushing Daisies. Ash, what did you think about it?
I love the show. I came to it well after it had been canceled, and so it was one of those things where I knew the end was approaching swiftly, and there was nothing that I could do about it. There was no hope. There were no Facebook campaigns that could save this thing from its demise.
You went through the 5 stages?
I did, all of them, and I think I went through them in about 30 seconds, so it was very dramatic. But I really, really enjoy the show, and part of the reason I enjoy the show is sort of how it's doing this magical realism thing. Right? It's so great. And essentially what magical realism is it's usually a literary genre for people that are unfamiliar with that. But what magical realism does is it has a world that is mostly anchored in reality. Everything is pretty relatable. It's not crazy or out of this world. But then slowly incorporates magical elements or has magical elements as inherent to its story world. So Ned's ability to wake people up from death and then put them back to death, and how that has no origin, it just is sort of the epitome of this magical realism thing. And so I really liked that what this show was doing was sort of resurrecting this this subgenre that a lot of people don't know about too much, and did it very well. And I really, that was just really satisfying for me as a viewer.
So I totally agree with you that it could fall into the category of magical realism. Although I do wonder a little bit about the realism, right? Because when I think of magical realism, I think of a world basically like our own that introduces either in a small way or a subtle way a magical element, right? Or it's a subset of society. But this doesn't seem like a realistic world to me. There's a literal company in season 2 that will rent out a best friend, and maybe that company actually exists. And I'm just not lonely. But there's a lot of very exaggerated aspects to the society. There's very strange. There's a literal convent a la The Sound of Music in wherever. Yeah, is it California? Is it New York? I don't. Where is it? The
but that's the point,
Right.
right? Is that so part of what magical realism is that you're just supposed to accept certain things as true. That's just, I mean, because even the narrator at the beginning of the pilot is like, no, it didn't come with a manual, this power that Ned has. It just is. It just is. And like that's the heart of magical realism. And so things are hyper saturated.
Though they make 3 rules, like they state in the first episode. Here's the 3 aspects of this.
Well, but those are based on experience, right? Those are based on he doesn't understand exactly what entity or what existence. Unlike something like, and I'm sorry I'm bringing this up again, but Buffy the Vampire Slayer, right? Where the magic is inherent, and it's sort of a discussion like there are locations where that comes from.
There's government.
There's government. There are systems in place that describe why those things take place. Religiosity, all of those are an important part. Whereas Ned is just a guy who happens to have this ability. And so those elements are more in the vein of magical realism and sort of encapsulate the experience of having that become part of the fabric of a world. And it's not exactly magic realism. So I think that's worth mentioning too. This is not a perfect example of that kind of genre, but Bryan Fuller's work has incorporated those elements sort of systematically. He drops in those pieces into almost everything that he does. And it makes, what I love about it is that Pushing Daisies is just so visually striking. And all of Bryan Fuller's series and works are. And that's really what's satisfying to me about it. Like the color saturation, the brightness of it.
There's definitely a Fuller aesthetic that exists in his body of work that you can look at something if you followed what he's done and you just, someone shows you an episode of television, you're like, that's a Fuller.
Well, for me, like I watched Hannibal and was like, oh, this is just a really, really dark version of Pushing Daisies. There were a lot of elements
if the pies were people.
Yes, and exactly, right? It was the episodes sort of, are about from week to week, especially in the first season of Hannibal, they're talking about one specific crime, and they're always these elaborate works of art. And very similarly in Pushing Daisies, the way that people die from episode to episode, the way their bodies are laid out on these slabs, and sort of the makeup and all of the different things that they add, people with actual literal tire tread, across their bodies, or they're frozen with icicles hanging on them, right? Like all of those very delightful.
Or they're filled with bees.
Or they're filled with bees, which is actually what happens in another episode of Hannibal. There is a very similar killer that does that same thing. So
maybe to contrast a little bit with Hannibal, right? Because Hannibal's a very tense, dark murder mystery show, and Pushing Daisies is also a murder mystery show. And for everyone listening at home, Jessica knows where I'm going with this, and the look of death she's giving me is just priceless. But the show to me has this overarching plot, right? It's Ned dealing with Chuck and his power and his personal life and all of those challenges. And then we have a monster of the week type thing, flavor episodic. This is the murder we're dealing with.
Right, a procedural.
Right, a procedural. And while I very much enjoyed that for the first half of the first season, I got very tired of it. It never feels like a show with a lot of tension. I never felt tense or scared or worried about what was going to happen. It was very disengaging. I was just waiting to get back to the plot that was larger over everything. I was waiting to say, oh, cool, well, I don't actually care about the magician's death in season 2 with Fred Willard, which I did really like that character, Fred Willard's character, the magician. But I didn't really care about that. I was more interested in, okay, so what's happening with Chuck? What's happening with her father? What's happening with all of this? And I felt like if the show was about that for me, I would have liked it better, because I liked it all right. It's very cute. I love Digby like I love my own parents. He's the best part of the show to me, at least in season 1. But I really just couldn't get behind the main procedural mechanic of the show. I didn't think it was terribly interesting.
For me, I actually think it does something that a lot of crime procedurals, and perhaps this is, maybe me coming from like a world where I've seen a lot of CSI and a lot of Criminal Minds. And so for me, the utter cleverness of these sort of parodies of that genre, that playing with these kinds of expectations, for me was really exciting. And I actually found the cleverness of it, and especially the dialogue surrounding each of these pieces, and even some of the commentary about the way our society works, even though it's sort of this, bright mirror of our existence. Just the way that products are used or people are participating in them. I think there's an episode, where they're all dying because they're trying to use the weight loss systems. And I really enjoy, I think that's funny. And that's part of what's so intriguing about Fuller, is that so frequently he's able to make something that I think almost all of us are sort of petrified about, this notion, this oppressive sense of death that pervades all of our interactions, and sort of twist it so that we're constantly having to face it, but that it's delightful. And that's part of what's so horrifying about Hannibal. Hannibal is this moment where, as they sit down to these magnificent feasts and the camera pans over this elaborately devised thing, your mouth waters. And then you realize that they're about to eat people. And at the same time,
you're a monster.
I think that's what the space that Bryan Fuller works in is trying to make that more palatable, to make it more recognizable, to keep talking about those things. And so for me, that's why Pushing Daisies really succeeds, is because it's doing that. It's necessary part of life, this death. And so that sense always pervades each and every episode.
Well, and that it keeps the ultimate satisfaction of what a procedural is supposed to do, and that's give you a sense of closure, right?
Every time.
They find the killer, and there's something just so transcendent and satisfying to me about waking up a murder victim and asking them who did it, and them knowing who did it, and then figuring out how they did it, right? So instead of figuring out who did it in a lot of these episodes, we know who did it. It's figuring out how they did it, and then it comes up with these really creative ways that they went about the crime. And so there's something, it is a parody of the genre, but it also maintains those elements of the genre that are what make people come back to them. That's why we have 97 billion crime procedurals on TV at any given point in time.
Exactly. Well, and I can understand some of your criticism about, there are moments in the episode when they're waking people up and having these conversations week to week, where they're like, who killed you? But they never quite get to that part of the question, right. And they have to, fix the problem, and put them back to death. And so I totally get, there have been moments where I've been like, just say the thing. Right. I know you can do it, and there's always something that distracts, Chuck gets in the way, or, so I totally get that. But I think for me, the overall satisfaction of the world and of the quirkiness of it. I mean, I love the Darling Mermaid Darlings, their whole synchronized swimming thing, and their
eye patch
and their cheese, right? Like the pie. Those things are so delightful that I think it counterbalances, and in fact is so much better than most procedural television for me.
Right. I guess for me, the thought is, yeah, all of those things are great, but none of those seemed like they had anything to do with the actual procedural part. Like the quirky characters, because one thing that I've heard described about this show, and I would generally agree with one major exception, is a character-driven show. It's very strong in that sense. I think Emerson Codd is a great example of that. He's very funny, charming, he's consistent, drives it,
he knits his
growth.
Holster. I mean, how much more adorable can you possibly get?
Right. I mean, the whole premise of you've got Ned having to come out of his shell and be a human being and connect with this person, and you've got Chuck, who she's getting a second chance at life. And I think there's a lot of things that frustrate me about them. Ned in particular. I think Ned frustrates me a lot. but I get it. I get what he's representing, sort of the
Adorkableness.
Yeah, the adorkableness.
No, and there are some real problems with the ways that he deceives Chuck throughout the series. Like, I do think he's pretty ethically ambiguous in a lot of ways.
But they don't suffer consequences for that, and that's kind of what bothers me. Because they'll take an episode, so it'll be, hey, Chuck, I brought you back to life, but I didn't tell you that it caused the funeral director to die. Oh, well, that's okay. Like, I'm okay with you having done that, despite the moral ethical implications. We resolved that in an episode. Or, hey, Chuck, I killed your dad. Well, we took an episode and we're good now. Or, hey, I actually kept my dad alive and someone else died. It's, well, I did the same thing with you. So it just seems like I was never worried about it. Just, well, they'll resolve it by the end of the episode. Mm-hmm. I was confident in that, and so I didn't care.
Right. Well, and I feel like there's parts of me that wish this series had finished out. Just because I think you're right. I think that some of those threads that they were pulling on, they were doing it really quickly. Mm-hmm. And they were moving through material really quickly. And so there's a question of, like, what would have happened next, right? What's the next part of this puzzle? Do we get more information? Do we get a sense of... And that's consistently how I feel about Bryan Fuller's shows. There's just all of this stuff left hanging... gaping wound left in my soul, where the unfinished thing. And I want the world to recognize that we need some sense of closure, at least once, with something that Bryan Fuller is going to do.
Well, they tried to do a comic book that keeps getting delayed for season 3.
Oh, really?
So I've read interviews with Bryan Fuller where he talks about kind of where would you take Ned and Chuck, and he's talked about it, it's like 10 years later. Like, this is a long-term story. If he had his choice, I'm sure this would be an 8 or 9 season show. And I wonder if there's a pacing issue with that, where it seems like he wants to elongate things, because there's usually, here's 5 or 6 episodes and then major plot point, right? And then here's another 3 or 4 episodes. And I don't know if that's well-paced or if it's weird. It didn't feel organic to me.
Right. Well, and I think that how quickly, and that's part of why I think it's important to talk about Pushing Daisies as television history, because it does buck against some of those consistent things that we see from episode to episode in other kinds of television.
Well, especially network television.
Exactly, right? And so it defies so many of those things for other satisfying elements that I think it has a really important place in kinds of conversations. One of the things I frequently really enjoy about the show is the way that it handles romance, right? So in most television shows where you have this will they, won't they couple, at some point the distractions, the frustrations that prevent them from being together are so utterly contrived that you just want to slap everyone, and be like, wake up, be a part of this relationship. How many times are you going to walk in on the other person having a polite conversation with somebody of the, that they're attracted to? And so how can we fix that problem? How can we actually make that story interesting? And in Pushing Daisies, they actually do that. They have this really satisfying tension about, like, how are they going to get together? How is this relationship going to culminate? How can they be in a relationship without that element? Especially when it's something they both really desire, clearly.
Well, the interesting thing in doing some research while watching this show, and also speaking with my girlfriend who brought this up to me, something that she was aware of, is that in the queer community, specifically with the asexual community, they typically look at Ned as a representation of asexuality on television. And what they talk about is that Ned and Chuck, while seemingly sexual beings, it doesn't speak about stating outright, oh, we're asexual. But there's a lot of clues there. Typically, they don't really like touching, or at least Ned doesn't really like touching people a lot. But they have this barrier between them, right? That they can't touch each other. And while they seem like they could be with anyone, Ned has the opportunity to have sex with Olive probably 4 or 5 times within the first episode. He can act on any of those sexual desires. They can be with anyone in the world, but they just want to be with each other, and their relationship is inherently romantic. Yes. We so often pair sexuality and the sexual desire with romance. And we forget that sometimes for people that are biromantic or heteroromantic, but not sexual, that they're actually two different things in a lot of schools of thought. And what's beautiful is you brought up like a culmination, because for us, we think about like, well, how can they touch? How can they hold each other? How can they have sex? What was brought up to me was a theory like from the movie Airplane where they just wear the giant condoms. That's one possibility. But the thought is, sex is the culmination of their relationship. If they could achieve that, then all barriers would be gone. But I think that's sort of a heterocentric, heteronormative thought of sex isn't the culmination, that they can have a satisfying relationship, never touching each other, just being romantically in love, but never physically acting on it.
Well, and I think that part of what's interesting about Fuller, generally speaking, is the way that he interacts with taboo, right? And this is one of the pieces of that. So while it's highlighting and utterly charming in the ways that it tries to deal with their interactions, they're kissing through saran wrap. They have these sort of incubator devices. They have an elaborate dance that they use to walk through the apartment, and bells and, all sorts of cute elements. There is also this piece of it that looks at sex and sort of makes it feel taboo, right? It makes it feel like those kinds of physical interactions are forbidden. And I think that adds a lot of element of a desire to the show. And I actually find that really satisfying in the ways that it sort of engages with that.
I just gotta say, I have to say it. If there is a criticism to be made about the romance, it's that she's dead. Well, and this is sort of the crux of it, right? Because she's not dead. She's not a zombie. She's alive again. But being alive again implies that she was dead, which we know she was. So, like, she's deadness.
She's pretty dead.
Yeah. Oh, she's super pretty dead. But
well, it comes to talk about, right? Because you think about like, she drowned. So if you just like empty out the water and bring her back,
she's fine.
She's fine. It's functional.
She didn't get run over.
Right. Yeah, he's bringing back people who should not be able to function as humans. So there's definitely the magical element of it. So she's not like a person who died for 5 minutes and got resuscitated. She is magically brought back. Which means Ned is not a necromancer. He's Jesus. He's literally resurrecting people magically.
But this is just sort of the crux of the issue, right? Is I wonder if some of that taboo that's happening, right? Because what Bryan Fuller, you mentioned it earlier, a lot of what Bryan Fuller does is he's having us have these charming interactions with death. Because death, Dead Like Me does the similar thing, right? That there are we always have to sort of confront our own mortality, but what if we could confront our own mortality with adorkable pie makers? Like, this is sort of
it's
this
exactly
is what
I'm
doing.
saying. Yeah.
And so I think some of the taboo in the romance, they can't touch because she'll die again, and then she's super dead, not just theoretically dead, but then they also can't touch because that's necrophilia.
Well, and that's part of what happens in Dead Like Me, which is one of Bryan Fuller's other shows. And it highlights, some of my favorite television is stuff that has these elements of absurdity in them. So, the main character in Dead Like Me, the reason that she ends up dead is she gets hit by a space toilet. So and that's how it happens. It's really unfortunate because she has to keep explaining to people that that's the way that she died, and it's embarrassing. And that's part of what Dead Like Me sort of engages with is these other parts of death. But their setting where they get all their assignments, because they're Grim Reapers who go around collecting souls before people die to help make the transition a little easier on them. And they all meet in a Waffle House. So there's like Mandy Patinkin is standing there handing out these assignments over waffles. And it's delightful. And yet it makes us recognize that death is such an essential part of life. And I like the way that Pushing Daisies always brings that to the fore and is constantly sort of reminding us, even in our relationships, right? There's a piece of sexuality that is tied to life and tied to death at the same time. And so that ability that we have is connected. And I think that that's what makes Fuller so interesting, is that he loves to highlight the ways in which death is everywhere. So that's kind of creepy. But, and I, one of the other things that I thought I would plug, just because I have the microphone to do it, is there's a pilot episode that Bryan Fuller did called Mockingbird Lane, which is about the Munsters. Like, it's just a revamped version of that television show. And it is, I know, right? And
we are on fire with these puns today.
And it's so great. It has Eddie Izzard in it, and it's fantastic. One episode, and then it was over. And
that's the shortest Fuller
cracked
ever.
My heart open.
You have to be okay with death. That's his whole point.
Yeah.
The death of the show.
And so it's kind of ironic, right? That's sort of his shtick, and it continuously gets brought up over and over again. Even, American Gods opens up, and the whole first episode is a funeral.
Yeah.
Well, I'm interested to
and
see...
graveyards and bloodbaths and bone yards.
Well, I'm interested to see what happens with the whole series of American Gods, because it's an adapted work,
yes,
as opposed to an original Bryan Fuller creation. And I love American Gods. I love Neil Gaiman, and I think it'll be an interesting thing to watch.
Yes,
I should say, literally.
Well, I've seen the pilot of American Gods, and it is beautiful. It's Fuller to the end. It's like, if the only way Fuller could get better is if he had Neil Gaiman, and now he has Neil Gaiman. And that's exactly what's happening in this thing, because Neil Gaiman is just this brilliant storyteller. His mind does things that I can't even fathom. And now you've got Fuller's saturated color, his, penchant for the over dramatic. It's almost Hannibal-esque in that way, but it's also on Starz. Yeah. And so I'm wondering how maybe not being on a network will work for him, because American Gods has already been renewed.
Yeah, well, and that was sort of I've been watching all of the episodes as they've dropped, and it's interesting to me because it doesn't really feel like television. Yeah. At all. It's sort of, and I wonder if that's really been what Bryan Fuller's problem has been. You mentioned sort of, it's irritating to me how the procedural stuff from week to week, that episodic part of the show isn't as compelling as the rest of Pushing Daisies. Mm-hmm. And the truth is that that's a problem that we're all trying to figure out, right? Mm-hmm. The serialization of television, moving from one episode to another episode and continuing that same story, is part of a larger growing tradition that's taken us some time. And part of the thing is that we're participating in these shows differently than we ever have been before, because of the internet and because of Netflix. And so I wonder if finally we'll get to see some of sort of the victorious thing. Bryan will be able to fully realize his vision, because it won't be a constrained by these episodic pieces.
Well, and you just have sort of a longer leash, I should say, when you're working with a premium network like Starz or HBO or anything like that. Yeah. And like we mentioned, Neil Gaiman, he kind of has that same penchant for how we interact with death. Mm-hmm. In the Sandman series and the Lucifer comic. And it's really interesting what they both do, where they take death and they... I don't want to say commercialize it, but make it into an office thing. Like you mentioned with Mandy Patinkin at the Waffle House. It's like, oh, this is our day-to-day. Like, oh yeah, I just revived dead people. Or my business is about me reviving dead fruit.
Right.
Yeah.
But
it's very small. And I've always had a fond spot in my heart for that kind of thing. How they interact with death is a very, I guess, procedure. It's just like, oh, this thing happens. We do X, Y, we fill out Form Z, and we do this.
Well, and that's part of, a larger sort of sense. One of the things that's been really interesting to watch for me is sort of how Fuller continues to connect his universes together. And there's a theory about the Fullerverse, which is sort of shows... in Hannibal, there's a character who was in Dead Like Me who plays a similar, she can see dead. She is dead herself. She thinks she's dead. And so he's sort of pulling these threads and connecting each of his universes. I'm really excited to see how he does that in American Gods, right? And that's part of what's interesting about American Gods too, is that he's moved from magical realism to something that's sort of explicitly magic or spiritual or about worship.
Fantastical.
Yeah, fantastical in a way that isn't just, it is part of the world that doesn't require explanation, but it's a little bit more an accepted part of that reality. And there's theories and legends about why that's the system that works.
Yeah.
And so I'm interested to see how he kind of combats that and vagues it up a bit. And that's been my experience with American Gods. I've been sitting there going like, what is happening? Because I haven't read the source material. And so the way that Fuller is just relying on the audience to use interpretation to talk about these elements of the story is really interesting.
Well, and how they're dropping hints and dialogue a lot. Like, they're not actually explaining much of anything.
No.
But what they're trying to do is just give you a little bit. So in the pilot episode, Ian McShane's character, Mr. Wednesday, gives this little mini speech about planes, right? And do planes fly because Newton talked about, like, the uplift under the wing? Or do planes fly because the 80 people on the plane believe that it's going to fly?
Yeah.
And is it faith or science? And so all of a sudden you've got this, you're like, oh, well, that seems weird, but it also seems important. And if, especially if you haven't read the source material, like dropping those little tiny tidbits is really helpful. And if you have read the source material, that's just like Easter eggs. That's, you know,
right. I get what that means.
Yeah, you're just like, aha, that's significant, even though it's just a stupid speech about planes.
Right. And that's what's so exciting about American Gods, is that we're going to be able to see that grow over time. And what it's really going to require on the part of the audience is a lot of patience, right? I think you're going to have to be, if you engage with this series, especially if you haven't seen the source material, you're going to have to wait for it. And so I'm really interested to see, you know, a television medium that's trying to depart from our general expectations, where, like, you know, I thought the pilot was deeply exciting, but it was also confusing. And so we'll have to see how that grows into something real.
I feel like you've described every Bryan Fuller pilot.
Yeah.
I feel like if you say we all have to be patient, that's every show.
Every single thing.
Which is why his shows keep getting canceled.
Oh.
Or maybe people should stop sucking.
Amen.
Wait, let's see. Okay, on the scale of everyone, vote at home, tweet at us. Do you think people would start sucking, or Bryan Fuller will start making shows that don't get canceled? Which is more likely?
So,
Rude.
if we were going to give Pushing Daisies a grade, and I think my nostalgia for the series, like, is going to really...
Well, why don't you start then?
Yeah, so I'm going to give it an A. Like, it's a great show. I love all of it. I think the unfinished nature of it leaves something about it. You know, you mentioned some of the problems that you had with the series. But for me, because of it's how short-lived it is, what's there is so valuable and so amazing. So I would give it a solid A. I revisit that series over and over again, and I find it just absolutely charming. So that's how I felt. What do you think?
No, I think I'd give it an A-. And I think part of it's just because, you know, I do have to concede a couple points to Scott about how the pacing can be a little strange sometimes. There's a couple plots where I'm like, so someone clearly just pulled that out of their butt. It was a slow week in the writer's room. You know, there's a couple of the deaths that are just a little too weird. And so, you know, that's sort of an issue for me. But I love the magical realism of it. I love how it's adapting magical realism for television in a way that we don't usually see. Because usually in television, it's either in our world or it is completely out of our world. And there's not a lot that can sort of tread that line as well as I think Pushing Daisies treaded that line. So I'm going to give it an A- because I love it.
I never give grades for incomplete work. No.
Burn! You're killing me, Scott.
I know. So I would probably give it a C+.
Oh.
Whoa.
The C+ is on
man, why did we should have had Scott go first
Yeah.
to give the grade, and then we could have ended where I wanted to end.
Yeah, no,
A. It's an A,
We're
people.
ending where I want to end. So the episodes where there's a lot of Digby, those are an A+++. That dog is the greatest dog. I believe it's episode 3 of season 1. He fills my heart with love. But overall, the series, I'm going to give it a C+. The pacing's strange. The mechanic doesn't work for me. There's some interesting stuff about romance, but I feel like it depends a lot on being cute and being flashy and being kind of kitschy and clever. And eventually that runs out for me, and I require more substance to it.
Interesting. Well, we vehemently disagree with you, and you are wrong. But so
we value your wrong opinion.
Thank you.
Sort of. In this
Thank
instance, it's there's
I'm
a
going to start a
caveat.
poll on the Facebook group, and we're going to see who's really wrong.
So, what did you guys watch this week, though? What are you excited about?
So what I'm watching, I've been rewatching Kimmy Schmidt in anticipation of season 3, which I will be starting shortly. Probably right after we get done with this podcast. I absolutely loved season 1. I watched the first episode when it came out. I was like, oh, okay. I really like 30 Rock, so I'm totally down for Tina Fey. I really like what she does. I like Ellie Kemper. I think this will be interesting. I don't know a lot about it. And I finished it. I texted my girlfriend and said, you need to watch this show now. And we started 30 minutes apart, and 8 hours later, I had finished season 1. It's one of the few shows that I've actually binged first to last episode in one sitting in one evening. And I could do that because I was in college at the time, and I didn't have a full-time job. So
Curse responsibility.
I know, right? So I finished that, and I loved it so much, and I was like, this is really important, and it speaks so much about survivorhood and being a victim, and it's so smart in the way that it talks about these really tense...
Females are strong as hell.
Exactly, right?
Yeah.
It talks about meme culture like that, and it's super interesting and empowering, and it talks about these really dark, horrible things, but in a way that's so palatable and meaningful.
You
And
mean
then-
like pushing daisies? Oh!
Right. You're right. That's a great contrasting example of a show that does it well and a show that doesn't.
Oh.
Don't test me, Ashley. But then season 2 came out, and I was like, oh, you got bad. And season 2 is just not good at all. It's the Community season 4 of television on Netflix. It just really lost... It went for the gimmicks, but not a lot of the heart. And Tina Fey has like dumb commentary about people who comment about the things she does on the internet. So it just seems kind of petty. So I'm hoping season 3 is a return to formula for season 1 and not a continuation of season 2.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I really feel like the episode in and of itself, or that show in particular has like took a dramatic drop off. But so for me this week, I feel like I already turned in my homework. Watching American Gods, so that's a series that I've been really excited for and anticipated a lot of. I'm really disappointed about the limited ability to watch the show. It's only available like on Stars. You have to get the special package, and it was really irritating. I had to subscribe separately to get my hands on it. And I was mad about that. So, other than that...
Capitalism.
You would never download a TV show illegally on the internet.
No, I would never do that.
And no one ever should.
That's...
No matter how easy or convenient it is.
So, no, because I respect Bryan Fuller, and I want to give him... I do want to give him my money. I just wanted it to be part of the money package I was already dropping. So, so yeah, I've enjoyed it. I think the quality is excellent. I think it'll be really interesting to see how it translates in this medium, because I think it's going to require a lot of time and energy in order to participate. And didn't you, Ashley, you were kind of telling me that like you were preparing to go into it because you knew it was going to be heavy.
I knew it took me, so I just watched the pilot, and it's 3 episodes in right now, and I just brought myself to watch it last night because I just knew it was going to be heavy, and it's going to be dense, and it's going to be dark. It's going to be worth it, but I also feel like that's not something I can just start playing, before I go to sleep. That's something you have to like sit down and go, I am going to watch American Gods now, and then brace yourself for that experience. So.
Right. Okay.
But speaking of things that aren't American Gods, so in honor of our TV history, I've been rewatching Arrested Development.
Oh, really?
Which is, absolutely one of my favorite shows by and far. I was introduced to it by my high school boyfriend. He's like, you gotta go watch the show. And he like gave me the DVDs way back when, before the Netflix. And I love that show, and I'm just re-experiencing my love for it. It's so good. And it's one of those things where it also got canceled because it was just it was too above.
Yes.
Where a lot of people could
The pushing
function.
daisies problem.
It was the comedy is so smart and it's so subtle, and they don't just play for the joke. Like, they just drop in the joke and they keep running, and if you missed it, you missed it. And I just love it about that. And I'm actually really happy that Netflix just announced that they're giving it a fifth season.
Right.
Right.
Because season 4 was not.
It got
formula.
resurrected, but it wasn't on formula. It's a little off.
Remind me about the time I met. Remind me to tell you about the time I met Jeffrey Tambor.
Oh, he seems great.
He is
great.
really cool.
He's so cool. Did you meet him at the same?
No,
same...
I didn't meet him, but I've followed his career, and I love pretty much everything he does. So
and Arrested Development is just beautiful, and like I understand the reason why the resurrection of it, the fourth season that's up right now, was a little off, was because everybody was doing other projects. So a lot of the episodes, instead of being focused on everyone in the family at the same time, they focused on one member of the family and what they were doing, and then intertwining them really smartly. But it also, like, what makes the show is how this family of terrible people who love each other interacts with one another.
Right.
And when you're only having one person here and one person there, that kind of loses some of the magic for me. But also just Ron Howard's narration. I would just tune in to listen to Ron
I know
Howard.
that's the best part.
Job
When I realized he was the narrator, that was great. So.
Job was learning life lessons all over the place. Like just stuff like that is so beautiful.
I'm going to be a star. He was not going to be a star.
So, no, I think Arrested Development is a great piece, and it pushes all of those boundaries. So, thanks for joining us on UniversiTV this week, and we'll see you next week, or in 2 weeks when the episode drops.
Well done.
We'll see you around.
Right. You know, it'd be really great to add as well at the end of this episode, where we sign off by saying all our names again, like we do at the end of every
episode. I'm Jessica Richards.
I'm Ashley Zanter.
And I'm Scott Nielsen. And thanks for stopping by.
Make sure to check us out on Facebook or Twitter by liking us at UniversiTV Podcast, or you can email us at universitytvpodcast@gmail.com with your recommendations for future episodes.